Great question coming up here, and I love it so much. How do you deal with the psychology of injury when you're dealing with an athlete who is prepping for a show or a meet? It's a really, really important thing, and I think it's overlooked quite a bit. One of the things that I truly believe is that we become stronger and more resilient during hard times, right? Just think about the gym, right? We have to go through the struggle, but then we come out the other side bigger and stronger. When we go through heartbreak, when we go through grief, if we lose a loved one, if we go through a bad breakup, it's almost impossible not to come out of those situations a different person and a bit smarter. Maybe if it was a bad breakup, maybe you learned something from that relationship that you could have done differently, or you've learned how to maybe not let your guard down too soon or something like that, right? If it was a loss of a loved one, you've learned to reframe death perhaps, right? Or you've learned to appreciate time you have with loved ones while they're still here. All of these things are ways that you are increasing your resiliency following hard times. Injury is no different. When you go through an injury, you learn so much about your body, about your mind, and you come out the other end much more resilient and much stronger. Think about the pandemic, right? We were forced out of the gym, and we were forced to find creative ways to work out. We learned so much about training during the pandemic because we had no other choice. We had to be creative. All of a sudden, that tree in your yard became a pull-up bar, right? That dining room chair now became a rear foot elevated split squat tool, right? Your 2-year-old daughter now became a load to hold while you're doing your goblet squats, for example, or walking lunges, right? The point is, whenever you are restricted or whenever you are forced to overcome something, you usually get better because of it. So I like to start with that. I like to first listen to the athlete, right? I want to make sure they feel heard. That's the most important thing. I want to make sure they feel heard. I want to listen to understand. I don't want to judge. I don't want to, if they say something that may not be true or may be kind of a false narrative or something that maybe is based on like pseudoscience, if that's what they come to the table with, I want to first listen to understand. I'm not going to shut anything down, and I want to make sure that I truly understand. I want to ask questions. I want to ask questions to make sure that I understand completely and make sure they know that I understand. And then I start with the conversation about how pain and injury can be a blessing, and it can really be a time for growth. And then I'll ease into some education. And with the education comes reassurance, because a lot of those toxic narratives that they may be coming with from the internet, social media, perhaps another healthcare provider, if I can reframe their mindset with some evidence, with some experience, with some logic, then perhaps they will kind of approach this whole thing differently. And that's huge. If we could switch that mindset, gosh, that's more than half the battle in my experience, right? So if someone is coming to me with a herniated disc, right? Maybe they got an MRI, doctor told them that the disc is pushing against their nerve and they need to go to physical therapy and perhaps have surgery, and they're taking some medication now to help decrease inflammation on the nerve. Patient goes home, they start Googling things, looking things up on Instagram. All of a sudden, they have this very defeated mindset. All of a sudden, every time they bend forward, they're feeling like that jelly of the disc is squirting out more. That it can be very depressing, can be very fear-inducing, can be very restrictive. Perhaps they walk differently. Maybe they walk a bit stiffer. They don't stand up quite as tall. They're not quite as confident. They feel weaker. They feel broken. Come in to speak with me, and like I said, we listen, ask questions, and then when it's my turn to talk and educate and provide reassurance, I explain to them, you could have had this herniated disc for 10 years and never even knew about it. A lot of times these things are in there before we even know it. And it's quite normal to find herniated discs on MRIs. And we can talk about some statistics of how many asymptomatic people have these kind of findings on MRIs, just so that they realize, oh, this disc is not some kind of disease. It's not some kind of diagnosis. It's just something we see on an image. It's just something like gray hair or wrinkles on our skin, but on the inside of my spine. Okay, so if I potentially had this herniated disc for all these years, and I've done all those activities that I love so much all these years, maybe we can get back there. That switch can be so powerful in starting treatment. It cannot be overstated. So that's where I like to start with athletes who may be kind of feeling a bit depressed or a bit anxious about a new diagnosis or some new pain, especially because what we do is not a hobby, right? In the gym, competing, going to a meet, even not competing, like just training in general. It's who we are. It's what we do. It makes us us, and we're passionate about it, right? It's part of our lives. If that's threatened, our identities are usually threatened, and that's not a good feeling, right? So I think injury can also help us look inside and find our true identities and find out who we are without training. And it'll also make us more thankful that we're able to train. If you've ever been faced with a situation where you thought you'd never train again, but then someone gives you some tools to maintain a training effect with some modifications, well, that's really empowering, and it really makes you thankful for the gym. Back to the pandemic, if anyone had gym equipment, I had minimal gym equipment, but I was able to train everything I had to train week to week. I felt so thankful that I had all that during the pandemic, because I realized that not a lot of people had it. So whenever it's threatened, whenever your passions or what you love is threatened, like during an injury, I tend to notice that there's more appreciation for it. I also like to explain to the patient that or the athlete that these things are not permanent, right? The modifications that we come up with, this dance back and forth of symptom modification, it is not permanent. We will not be doing this for the rest of your life. This is just so that we can calm down this area, so that we can load it. And desensitize it for the next couple weeks, and then we're going to get the heck out of these modifications. You're going to go back to training and not think about this stuff. If it ever creeps up again, you now have a bunch of tools you can throw at it, but I don't want the athletes to think that they're going to have to do these like modified box squats for the rest of their training, or have to do this mobility work for the rest of their life, or have to modify their dumbbell lateral raise for the rest of their life, because that's not the case. So I like to also let them know, as we're going through the process of finding modifications to their activities, that this is not something you're going to be doing forever. It's just for now. So bear with me. Let's just get through this initial phase, and then we can progressively load this thing appropriately. This is also a good time to revisit goals, right? So if it is a high-level athlete who's preparing for a bodybuilding show or a powerlifting meet, for example, we need to think, okay, is this an injury that we should that would cause us to pull out of this prep? We have to think of a training career as a long-term investment. If we're going to potentially make ourselves worse in the long run by continuing to grind to get to this arbitrary competition, that's probably not a good thing. Think of it like an investment where you take a hit initially, but then you're going to end up making more down the road. That's an important conversation definitely to have, because if we're in a prep, say bodybuilding for example, we're in a caloric deficit. We are just basically fatigued all the time. We are pushing the limits just by existing. If we're trying to recover from an injury and we're implementing some modifications, we're implementing some changes to activity, to sleep, to recovery, and it's just not working and it's getting worse, and we still have 3 months until the show, perhaps the best option is to pull out, right? Or at least take a diet break. or a week off or a deload, right? That being said, if this is an athlete at the pinnacle of their career, and this is like an Olympic qualifier or a world championship, and maybe the athlete is nearing retirement, maybe the conversation has to be had where we need to push through this, and let's just plow through and deal with the repercussions after. And that's totally fine too, as long as the athlete and coach or clinician are on the same page. These are times when having that hard conversation with the athlete are super, super important. And the only way you can have those conversations with the athlete is if you built that trust up initially. So that athlete, clinician, athlete, coach relationship is so, so important for conversations like this, when we have to talk about possibly pulling out of a season to fully recover, right? And we know that our health is the most important thing. And I know from experience, from firsthand experience, that when you're in a prep and you're going through something like that, sometimes you're not thinking logically, and you need that coach who's not in a prep or that clinician who's not in a prep to tell you, like, hey, we need to get this checked out. We cannot keep grinding like this because it's not serving us. And sometimes we need that reality check, and I am not immune to that as well. So that's why it's so important to have that comfort and that trust in that relationship. So those are my main points about athlete psychology, and it is something that, again, I have found to be such an important part of the whole recovery process, and it all starts with a foundation of trust with the athlete and clinician, or the athlete and the coach.